So I'd like you to come with me into the way back machine to my childhood. Every fall, when I was a kid, I waited with great anticipation for the arrival of the Wish Book, also known as the Sears Roebuck Christmas Catalog. I see there are people here who remember that. For those of you so young that you missed out, Sears was the Amazon of its day in a lot of ways, right? Long before you could scroll endlessly online, you could flip through hundreds of glossy pages filled with just about everything you could imagine or want. But the Wish Book was different. It was special. It was devoted almost entirely to toys. Oh, how I loved that catalog. I nearly wore the thing out. I pore over every page over and over, carefully folding down the corners of the things I hoped might appear under the Christmas tree. By Christmas Eve, it looked as though nearly every other page was dog-eared. I had rather expensive taste, I think. But also, by Christmas Eve, I generally had two problems. I had convinced myself that I needed those things, was my first problem. My second problem was that I still belonged to a large family with a very modest budget. There was never the slightest chance that my Christmas morning would resemble that Wish Book. The hunger for the lavish, toy-filled Christmas morning lasted for a very long time. Years later, when Kevin and I had children of our own, I discovered that every generation has its own Wish Book, in a way. Theirs happened to be the grocery store and the toy aisle at Target. Every shopping trip evolved into the same negotiations. I need cookies, they'd say. Well, no, you want cookies, I would reply. I need that toy. No, you want that toy. Now, to be fair, they might have had that confusion a little bit from me because I have been known on occasion to announce, I seriously need some chocolate right now. But parents spend years trying to teach their children the difference between wants and needs, because sooner or later, every family has to come face to face with the reality that there isn't enough money to buy everything we want. That's the lesson from the world's economy. It teaches us to count what we don't have, to calculate what we can't afford, to assume that there will never quite be enough. By the time we reach adulthood, we've become very good at thinking in terms of scarcity, which is why Isaiah's invitation is so astonishing. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. Wait a minute, buy without money? How does that work exactly? Of course, it doesn't make any sense. Isaiah isn't describing the world's economy. He's describing God's economy, the way God orders the world. In God's kingdom, grace isn't earned, mercy isn't rationed, and love isn't reserved for those who can afford it. God's abundance is given freely because that is simply who God is. The psalm continues with the same sort of picture. The eyes of all wait upon you, O Lord, and you give them food in due season. You open wide your hand to satisfy the needs of every living creature. Notice the image. God's hand isn't clenched into a fist, protecting what belongs to him. God's hand is open. That image carries us beautifully into today's gospel. To give us a little background, a setting perhaps, Jesus has just received the devastating news that his cousin John the Baptist, had just been executed by Herod. Matthew tells us just prior to this reading, well, actually at the beginning of this reading, that he withdrew to be by himself, taking a boat to a deserted place. He wasn't looking for a crowd. He was looking for a little space to grieve, but the crowd finds him anyway. Now, if anyone has earned a little alone time, it was Jesus. If anyone could have said, I'm so sorry, but just not today of all days, it was Jesus. Instead, Matthew tells us that Jesus saw the great crowd and had compassion for them. Compassion. That word is the hinge on which this entire story turns. The disciples, understandably enough, are still living according to the world's economy. The evening is coming. There are thousands of people here. We have 5 loaves and 2 fish. They do the math. It doesn't math out. This is a deserted place, they tell Jesus. Let's send these guys away. They can go buy some food elsewhere. It's a perfectly reasonable suggestion. In fact, it's probably the suggestion that most of us would make in that place. We simply don't have enough. But Jesus isn't taking an economic point of view here. He's taking a compassionate point of view. Instead of, shall we send them away, Jesus turns the question into, how shall we feed them? And everything else shifts. Notice at the beginning there, Jesus doesn't dive right into starting to multiply bread. He begins by involving the disciples. You give them something to eat. Can you imagine the looks on their faces? I can imagine the look on my face. 5 loaves, 2 fish, several thousand people. It's absurd. Perhaps, though, that absurdity is exactly the point. Miracles often are absurd. The disciples aren't able to create bread. They see only one solution to the problem. Then Jesus asks them to bring what they have. Turns out their part is simply to offer what little they possess. The miracle belongs to God. It seems to me that this is one of the hardest lessons in Christian living today. We are so accustomed to beginning with the question, do we have enough? Is there enough? We seldom stop to ask the questions that Jesus asks. We calculate our time, we calculate our energy, our patience, our resources, and often conclude that there simply isn't enough to go around. And maybe, just if we're lucky, there might be enough to meet our own needs. Jesus begins somewhere else. He begins with compassion. He sees people before he sees the problem. And once he's seen the people, the calculation becomes secondary. It is compassion that changes the problem from shall we send them away to how shall we feed them? And that shifts all of it. This is where Paul's words from Romans deepen the story a bit. Paul writes his great sorrow and unceasing anguish over the people. At first glance, it doesn't seem particularly connected to the story about bread, and perhaps it isn't. Paul reminds us there are many kinds of hunger, though. Some are obvious, like a kid flipping through a wish book, or an empty stomach, which announces itself quickly enough. Other kinds of hunger are hidden, and they're much harder to see. There's a hunger for hope when life has disappointed us. There's a hunger for forgiveness after we've failed. There's a hunger to simply know that our lives matter to someone. We carry those hungers quietly, and so do many people that we meet every day. Jesus sees them all. His compassion is never limited to the surface need. He sees the hunger beneath the hunger. That's why compassion is so central to this story. Compassion isn't pity. Pity looks from a distance. Compassion walks toward the need. Compassion changes the problem. The disciples want to know, how do we get rid of them? And instead, Jesus flips it to, how do we meet their needs? Those are still the two questions that come before the church today. Every day we have opportunities to ask either one of those. Do we effectively send people away because there isn't enough time or enough money or enough patience or enough energy? Or do we begin with compassion and trust that somehow, in God's economy, what we can offer will be enough? Yet another thing to notice in our gospel story is that after everyone has eaten, there are 12 baskets of food left over. Now, Jesus must have taken cooking lessons from my mom. Unlike my mom, though, Jesus actually could. He had the ability to calculate exactly how much food was needed. Instead, there was abundance. Abundance, make no mistake about it, is a choice that Jesus made. That's how God's economy works. Not extravagance for its own sake, but generosity that refuses to calculate love down to the last crumb. The 12 baskets are there for a reason. The leftovers become part of the miracle. They remind the disciples and us that God does not measure out grace with an eyedropper. God's generosity always exceeds our calculations. We are forever counting loaves, while God is filling baskets. The leftovers are evidence that God's grace is never just sufficient. There's always, always enough mercy for one more sinner. That doesn't mean we never face shortages in the real world. Of course we do. What it does mean is that scarcity never has the last word. Compassion should. As Christians, we're called to live as citizens of God's economy while still, unfortunately, inhabiting this world's. We still balance checkbooks. We still make budgets. We still make practical decisions. But we refuse to let scarcity become the lens through which we see other people. Because once compassion becomes our starting point, all of our questions begin to change. Instead of asking, how can we get rid of this problem, we ask, how do we love this person? Instead of asking, why don't I have? What don't I have? We ask, what do I have that I can offer? Instead of asking, will it be enough? We can ask, what is it that I can place into God's hands? That may be a meal, or a listening ear, or an invitation, or a prayer, or a phone call, or forgiveness, or simply showing up. The miracle is not that we suddenly become capable of solving every hunger in the world. The miracle is that God continues to take the ordinary gifts of ordinary followers and use them to feed hungry hearts. The disciples didn't leave the hillside marveling at their own generosity. They left carrying baskets that reminded them of God's generosity. May we leave this place carrying that same reminder. Not that we have enough, but that God, whose hands are always open, can take whatever we place into those hands and make it more than enough for a hungry world. Amen.